India and China are world's two oldest civilizations. From about 180 to 1000 AD, India and China constituted 56% of the world's GDP, with India constituting 33% and China constituting 23%. And by 1950, India's and China's GDP fell to just 4.2% and 4.5% respectively. Together, India and China fell from contributing half the global economy to just a mere 10%. And this considering the huge populations they possess. And from 1950 to 80, their share in global GDP declined further to just 3% for India and 2% for China. It is from 80s that China started growing rapidly to the level where it is now, becoming the second largest GDP. India, on the other hand, started to grow rapidly from the 90s, although not as rapidly as China. In 30 years, China grew to about $18 trillion, while India grew to almost $4 trillion. India has grown significantly until you don't compare it with China's. Oh my god, look at that growth gap. But if you compare with other countries, wow. But in geopolitics, you need to be like Indian parents. You need to compare with the best. Then only you'll set bigger goals and try to achieve that. If you compare with Pakistan, you'll feel wow. You'll stop setting goals and feel satisfied for wherever you are. But just because you need to compare with the best, can you start comparing India with US, UK, Germany or Japan? Would it be fair for India? No, not at all. But the comparison would be fair with a country like China, because both the countries were at some point in the same situation. From being in a nearly same economic situation, how did China run away to the top so far from India? What did China do that India didn't? Let's understand in detail. In this episode, we're going to compare China's and India's economic rise and understand how their political systems have played a role in their economic rise and try to decide which political system is the better one.
China has become the world's largest car exporter.
China into a global economic powerhouse, second in GDP only to the United States.
Can India really become the factory of the world?
When I first visited the US as a Prime Minister, India was the 10th largest economy in the world. Today, India is the 5th largest economy.
India will shake the world as we see it in the future.
Companies come to China because of low labor cost.
India's work productivity is one of the lowest in the world.
I'm actually incredibly excited about the future of India.
伟大光荣正确的中国共产党万岁!
It is not an unknown fact that the backbone of the development of a country is manufacturing. History proves those that industrialized went on to be developed powers, be it the UK in the 17th century, US and Germany in the 19th century, Japan in the post-war world. Manufacturing was the fuel that drove their economic growth engines. So China's rise can be attributed to its investment in manufacturing. It was not like out of the blue suddenly China realized in 1978 that they need to industrialize rapidly and become a developed power. They attempted tries from 1861 until 1978 and all three ended up in failures, giving them the same results. So what did they do different in 1978? They enacted a series of massive economic reforms pioneered by Deng Xiaoping. The primary one was opening up to the world.
Deng, presiding over an economy devastated by the Cultural Revolution, was opening up the country to foreign investment and trade.
Until then, China was more of a closed economy and ran a state-led economy. They shifted their policy from state-led growth to a market-led growth, from domestic-oriented manufacturing to export-oriented manufacturing. They envisioned to make China the world's factory and ended up making it one. To become a production powerhouse, you need 4 main factors of production: land, labor, capital, and infrastructure. For manufacturing, it requires a lot of land, and China had plenty. Labor, China had a 950 million population with 70% of them in the working age. And also the cost of labor was very, very low. Infrastructure, there was a world-class port in Hong Kong already. And they had Mao-era world-class rails and roads. And apart from this, they built special economic zones, the SEZs, and export corridors. With a good enough infrastructure and cheap labor, it attracted for massive foreign investments. Companies from the West started offshoring to China. Now with the capital of foreign companies, cheap labor and infrastructure, China started manufacturing goods at very low costs, which fetched competitive prices in the global market. But still, not good enough to be a world beater. They needed to produce even cheaper goods. They had a cheap labor, but the input costs were still high because they had to still import majority of the components. And now what did they do? They promoted their local industries. The SMEs, the small and medium enterprises, which employs anywhere between 5 to 500 people. They acquired technique and skills from the foreign firms and extensively manufactured the input components required for the bigger industries. They also manufactured consumer goods like textiles, footwear, toys, home appliances, and electronic items. Not thousands, lakhs and lakhs of small and medium enterprises emerged from the villages. They deployed a strategy where the entire manufacturing supply chain was to be located in China itself. So for example, to make a cotton t-shirt, it requires cotton, and then the cotton needs to be processed and made into a fabric. Then it needs to be stitched as a t-shirt and dyed with colors, and then embroidery or print if required. This entire manufacturing ecosystem was located in China itself. The local industries looking after the processing of cotton, and the big industries with the end product. It was the same with automobiles. The numerous input components required to make a car were made by the SMEs. They set up an environment as such, making it easy and quick to set up a business by minimizing regulations and speeding up all the governmental approval procedures. They made sure no companies broke the competition unfairly and formed a monopoly. In any consumer product niche, be it textiles, apparel, toys or home appliances, there were at least 100 companies holding a significant market share. To survive or make a mark in this highly competitive environment, the firms needed to be unique and an out-of-the-box thinker. To be unique, it requires an entrepreneurial mindset, and this gave rise to a generation of entrepreneurs and a rich entrepreneur culture in China. With a robust infrastructure, easy business environment, lucrative foreign capital, a smooth credit-flowing banking system, a huge working population at cheap wages, a thriving entrepreneurial culture, China started registering rapid growth rates, almost averaging 10% a year, and became the second largest GDP. But it's not just those economic reforms that propelled China's story. There's something else too that stood as a pillar. It's the political system of China. When the ruling Communist Party decided to enact those reforms, they wanted to ensure one thing: political stability. Why a political stability is a must? Because you don't want another government coming to power and reversing the policies altogether, which would affect the businesses. They wanted to ensure continuity of policies so that the businesses thrive. Hence, the Communist Party ensured they forever would be the only party that would rule China. It was a single party system in China, which literally means there is no opposition. If any party emerges as an opposition to the Chinese Communist Party, it's crushed. China is a single party dictatorship. So then, aren't elections conducted in China? It is conducted, but just to elect the Communist Party. At the national level, there's a strong central power with no opposition. The president is the highest level decision maker, and there is no way he can be ousted from power. But at the lower levels, that is the provincial levels and the local levels, direct elections are conducted. But the nominees contest only after the approval of the national level leadership.
Now China lack of democracy, lack of freedom, especially freedom of press.
Although China is a highly centralized state, it has devolved enough powers to the local governments. The top level ensures efficient functioning of the provincial and local level governments. Provincial level is just like the state level in India. So this kind of a political system with an irremovable president at the top and no opposition ensured a stable political environment. How did this stable policy act as a base for the economic growth? Not just through continuity of policies. There's much more to this. As I said earlier, there are 4 main factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. The most essential factor for production is land, and is also the most difficult to acquire. But it was never difficult for the Chinese government. If they wanted to acquire a land for a road project or to lease it to an MNC, they would simply do it by not even offering a fair compensation. And if there's any protest, it's crushed. Compare it to a democracy like India. Land acquisition is a tedious process, and a fair compensation definitely needs to be given. If not given, they'll be voted out of power. A fair compensation is a right of every landowner, but governments often shy away to acquire a land, fearing a backlash, fearing loss of the voter bank to their opposition. The flaw in Indian democracy is that if the ruling party brings up a policy, it would be opposed by the opposition, who themselves would have tried to bring up the policy while they were ruling. And the present ruling would have opposed it back then when they were in the opposition. With regards to any policy, there'll be some or the other group affected, and the affected would oppose it. It's democracy. There would be an opposition, and that opposition would side with them for electoral gains. The Tata Singur plant case is a very good example of this. In 2008, the communist government of Bengal had acquired 900 acres of land for Tata to set up a nano car manufacturing facility in Singur. This was a very important project for the Bengalis because they were reeling under severe unemployment and poverty. The communist government thought only with rapid industrialization, West Bengal can be made a prosperous state. But Miss Mamata Banerjee, who was the leader of the opposition, had other plans. She provoked the landowners to protest and cause frequent disruptions against the project. These disruptions forced the Tata Group to withdraw the project and move out of Bengal.
We do not want to come to an area where we perceive that we are unwanted.
From then on, for a long time, investors shied away from investing in Bengal. And today, the irony is, the present West Bengal CM Mamata Banerjee gives ads on newspapers for investors to invest in Bengal.
Come and invest. Please don't forget Bengal.
Another example, it happened recently in UP too. The UP government introduced a digital attendance to reduce absenteeism among government school teachers and students. But the opposition Samajwadi Party sided with the corrupt, disgruntled teachers and made the government withdraw the scheme, which otherwise could have been a good move to improve attendance in schools.
कि ऑनलाइन डिजिटल अटेंडेंस ली जाएगी. समाजवादी पार्टी ने उसका विरोध भी किया.
In China, this can never happen because even if some groups are negatively affected, there is no one to side with them. In India, for acquiring a land for an infrastructure project, what needs to be considered ideally? The environmental and economic impacts, right? But democracy forces governments to consider the political impacts too, whether this could affect their upcoming electoral chances or not. But in a dictatorial China, the ruling CCP doesn't have to worry about elections at all. Ideally, you see, democracy gives the people the options to choose the best for themselves. The parties would compete with each other to give the best governance to the people. But what's happened here? Parties are competing with each other to give bigger and bigger freebies to win elections. Democracy is reducing parties to just think about winning upcoming elections instead of focusing on long-term governance.
दिल्ली की हर महिला के अकाउंट में हर महीने हजार रुपए डाले जाएंगे.
In a dictatorship, the ruling party doesn't have to think about an election at all. It can just focus on governance. So does that mean democracy works only when voters are educated enough to choose what's the best for them? So as per Netaji Bose ideology, is it the authoritarian path the best to follow until the voters are educated enough? So this was about the first factor of production, land. The another factor of production, labor. When China initially enacted its economic reforms, it intentionally did not enact any labor reforms. It allowed the firms to exploit the labor by making them work for long hours and very low wages. This was also one of the reasons why China was an attractive destination for the Western foreign firms. They weren't allowed to form labor unions. They couldn't get on to the streets and protest against factory owners for unsafe working conditions. It was only in 1995 when a kind of situation was created where it was impossible for the foreign firms to leave China. The government enacted labor protection laws. This is the condition in a communist country. But the thing is, these low wages and overworked hours kept the product cost very low and gave a significant competitive advantage and thereby yielding high manufacturing outputs for China. Can this happen in India? It can never. India had enacted labor laws in 1948 itself. The Minimum Wages Act, Factories Act, Workmen's Compensation Act. In India, they could form labor unions to fight for their rights. They could go on a strike. They could get down to the streets to protest. It is not at all possible to exploit labor in India like in China. Now tell me, which country would the foreign firms choose among India and China? Of course, China, right? So now should we understand that if a country has to grow rapidly like China, then we should be taking the authoritarian path and not the democratic path that India has taken, right? But the US, UK, Japan, Germany, France and many European countries became developed to the democratic path itself. But you need to be understanding that the European countries were all the products of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th, 19th centuries that was infamous for severe labor exploitation. Japan could develop in the 1950s because it already had the experience of modernization in the authoritarian Meiji rule of 1850s. All these countries enacted protective laws for their workforce only after getting awareness of labor rights and achieving a certain level of development. Then should India also repeal all the labor laws and allow companies to exploit labor to become rich? Can we all forego our family time to overwork to make the country rich? Should we become authoritarian like China, ban opposition, suppress protests, censor media, acquire lands forcefully, pay low compensation, exploit labor to our way towards a developed nation? Do we have to ditch democracy? The thing is, democracy is just a means to achieve the end goal of national development. Why is it being used as the end goal itself? Why is there so much emphasis to prove the world our democratic credentials? Why so much emphasis on those sponsored democracy index reports? If China prioritized democratic image over national development, would it have developed so rapidly as it is today? Is democracy just a Western fallacy to keep the world in its control? Does India really require democracy? Let's seek answers for it now. Let's take the case of labor exploitation. Suppose if we take Mr. Narayana Murthy's wishes very seriously.
My country, I want to work 70 hours a week.
and enact a law to allow firms to make employees work for a minimum of 70 hours a week and also not compensating the employees accordingly. This would actually benefit in the country's rapid development, right? Authoritarianism would actually stand by this idea because a patriotic authoritarianism thinks on the overall interests of the country. Higher working hours of employees, higher productivity, higher tax collection, higher public spending and higher growth. That is how China grew, right? All those extra hours worked would result in a higher growth of the country and reduced poverty. Ultimately, a good standard of living is what we aim for, right? Let's exploit labor for 25 years, grow our national income rapidly, and then enact labor laws after our living standards have improved. Why enact now only when we are still behind? It's something like parents telling their kids, study well now, losing sleep and giving up your leisure time. You can enjoy all your life once your studies are done. Don't you think they're right? Don't you think this is the way to develop? We will develop. Make our country rich, but at what cost? The cost of the health of our hardworking employees, the cost of their family time and leisure time. Authoritarianism that prioritizes national development would definitely not listen to the health concerns of the hardworking employees. But it's only democracy that would give a voice to the hardworking employees. Please note, I haven't saying whether a country would allow or not. I'm talking whether the philosophical concept of democracy and dictatorship would allow or not. Democracy gives an opportunity to listen to the health concerns of the hardworking employees. But a dictatorship would simply ignore that, although it thinks for the greater good of the country. Democracy itself doesn't obstruct one to take decision. It rather helps taking a balanced decision by listening to all sides, by listening to both the side that gets positively affected and the side that gets negatively affected. Tomorrow, if by a survey the government finds that there's lithium reserves in a hill which could be a game changer for the whole country, decides to extract it and displace all the localites from there who've been farming there since generations. By this decision, the country at large might benefit, but a small population owning the lands will be at a loss. A democracy that has rights to people would let the world hear their grievances. Their voice, if heard loud, would try to minimize their damages in the form of a fair compensation or a better life in the place from where they got displaced. Would the government have reduced income tax if not for the outrage of the middle class on social media? 6 years ago, a steel flour project in Bengaluru was scrapped because of environmental concerns from the public. Can this happen in a dictatorship regime that only thinks about economic development? You see, even in China, the CCP in the center doesn't allow protests only at the national level, but is very sensitive to people's concerns at the local level, and that is why they've been very successful. When a government fails to perform, in a democracy, there's always an option to replace it. But in a dictatorship, the Mao's socialist model that mimicked the USSR model was actually a failure. It pushed the Chinese economy to deep distress and poverty. To make matters worse, the Chinese had no opportunity to replace them. Fortunately, some of the Deng Xiaoping reforms became successful. Dictatorship and authoritarianism would be the best model if you had a dictator who could do no wrong, who doesn't get corrupted by power, and who would follow the philosophy of maximum happiness for maximum people, foregoing the happiness of a few, like the Chinese Communist Party. If you had a patriotic dictator like CCP, it's fine. What if you have a selfish dictator like Kim Jong-un or a Gaddafi who loot the nation's resources all for themselves? What if you had a dictator like Taliban who think women don't need education? And what is the guarantee that a new leader who'd emerge in the CCP tomorrow would not usurp all the wealth of the country for himself? Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. Have you forgotten the emergency times? I earlier said democracy pushes the leaders to just think for the upcoming elections, but elections keep the leaders accountable to the people. Accountability enforces responsibility. This responsibility is what makes leaders work for people. Again, I want to note here, I'm only debating democracy versus dictatorship and not whether India is practicing democracy truly or not. You see, China with its authoritarianism has since time ignored environmental concerns from activists and is paying a huge price in the form of air pollution and climate change related floods and droughts. China is tearing down Islam by raising down mosques. The minority Uyghur Muslims are being persecuted ruthlessly, however evil their ideology may be. Hurting their religious sentiments by demolishing their mosques and building toilets over that can never be justified. A democracy would never allow that. It gives rights to the minorities. A free media would tell their story outside. There'll be someone standing for them, but minority rights can also be misused to appease them like in India. So what is the most suitable means to greater national development? Because both democracy and dictatorship has its pros and cons. For India, the democratic path in which it is traveling through is the best because India is a diverse country, be it population or geography. Democracy is the only philosophy that lets the diverse voices heard in decision making. Democratic path is a tough path.
In the evolution of the democratic spirit, India is the mother of democracy.
It keeps obstructing the doing of what's really good. The path of growth might be slow compared to someone taking the authoritarian path, but the growth would be long-term and sustainable growth. Right now, we might not have the most well-educated and aware voters. They might just be simply wooed by freebies. But as time passes, they'll be more educated and aware and vote thoughtfully, keep the governments accountable and demand the best governance from them. Parties will make it their agenda, the priorities of the voter. The people of Delhi made cleaning of Yamuna, access to clean drinking water, proper waste management system and curbing air pollution their priorities and gave AAP chance twice to do, but it failed. Although, let's not demean their efforts in improving government schools and hospitals infrastructure. Yet, Delhi voters voted them out of power for corruption because they held them accountable. Delhi is considered to be possessing one of the most educated electorates in the entire country, and it will be the same for the entire country as years pass. And coming to India's growth, I'm never blaming democracy alone for India's slower yet good growth. There are so many other issues. We lag behind in ease of business because of the long bureaucratic procedures. For example, why our small enterprises don't scale up their businesses? Because they want to be away from all the regulatory burden. And another reason, high taxes are the biggest problems why manufacturing isn't growing as it's expected. Apart from that, there's still so much corruption. All these things are unrelated to democracy and can be solved when people together hold government accountable and vouch for these reforms. A dictatorial rule might be tempting, but it's an uncertain path. If a dictator failed, people cannot hold them accountable. But if a democrat failed, people can hold them accountable and chose to replace them with a better administrator. Democracy is still the most sustainable path because we can always keep our leaders accountable. Democracy gives rise to dissenting voices. The dissenting voices shouldn't be crushed, but convinced. Ultimately, China and India have different growth trajectories. India can learn the best aspects from China and eke out the worst. But whatever, India and China look set to reclaim what they lost. While China has reclaimed quickly, India is not too far behind. It will eventually get there. Thanks for watching the video, and I'm eager to see you in another exciting episode of Comparison Lens.